We are talking today, this is Mysteries of Middle-earth. So it's been a while since we've done a Middle-earth live stream, but I thought what we would do was just go through a few of those things that maybe Tolkien never answered himself, or they're not 100% clear on first read-through of the books. As always, I've got some questions from my patrons. I will try and dig in as much as I can to questions in the chat as well. I'm going to give a shout out straight away to moderators who kept everyone entertained, I'm sure, while I was off. Thank you so much. I hugely appreciate that. If you could if you're in the chat, please do show them a little bit of love. Right, so let's go to a second try at answering my first question from one of my patrons. This is from Alexander the Just Okay, saying, "Hi, Robert, I hope you are doing fantastic." I am now, thank you. I was hoping you could talk a bit about the two watchers outside of the Tower of Cirith Ungol. Shagrat, or one of the other orcs, mentioned that it was built by the men of Gondor. It is also stated that they have trapped in them an evil spirit or will. Has Sauron modified them or embedded in them some evil sorcery? They seem to be extremely powerful, and I'd just like to hear your insight on their fascinating construction and the sorcery involved. Okay, so the two Watchers, they appear in the books, quite significant in the books. They don't appear in the films. There is just a moment where the camera sort of pans past them. It's a kind of like a nod to book readers that, yes, they are there, but they just didn't include them. Which I kind of understand, because their presence in the film would be quite jarring and would sort of seem to need some kind of explanation, and it might have sort of slowed the pace a bit. So I understand why they weren't there. But what are they? Well, Cirith Ungol, if you remember, is that watchtower fortress just on the border of Mordor. It's got the pass, which is where Frodo and Sam came through. Shelob's Lair's up there. The other side of it, we get this fortress, and we get a whole load of orcs who are garrisoned there. That's where, when Sam thinks that Frodo has been killed by Shelob, he goes there. Then Sam realizes his mistake, and then he has this great heroic moment when he goes in and rescues Frodo. So that's what we're talking about. On the outer wall, before you get into the courtyard, there's a gateway to get in. And on either side of the gateway, there are these two watchers. They're statues. And they have got they're like three bodies merged into one, with vultures' heads and jet black eyes, and one is facing straight outwards, one of them's facing straight back, one of them is facing straight across the gateway, and they're on both sides. And they've got within them these two powers. Firstly, the power to prevent enemies from getting in. It sort of creates this kind of, so like a force field, effectively preventing any enemies from getting in. Orcs are absolutely fine coming in, but enemies, no, going either direction. If you do somehow manage to get past that, then they let off this shriek, this really loud shriek, which is heard for all around. And Sam has to get in first. He gets through on his way into the fortress by holding up the Phial of Galadriel. Pure, holy light allows him to get through. He can get through, but he triggers the alarm. Big shriek, answering bell from the top of Cirith Ungol. On their way out, Frodo and Sam together, they hold up the Phial of Galadriel, and also they invoke the name of Elbereth. So that gets them through. Again, though, the shriek goes off, and they decide, well, they've got to get moving quickly, because anybody could have heard that. So that's what we've got going on. What are they? Well, you're right. The fortress itself is Gondorian. The history here is that at the end of the Second Age, last alliance of elves and men, Sauron was defeated, ring cut from his finger, etc., etc. And Mordor was cleared out broadly of evil. It couldn't be completely cleared out, but they'd done most of it. And the Gondorians who were there, Gondor was at the height of its power. They set up this series of watchtowers around the outside of Mordor. They knew if Sauron was going to come back, if evil was going to return, this is where they would try and make their home base. So, Cirith Ungol was one of those, and an important one, being on a pass through the mountains. However, over time, Gondor slowly went back on what its duty was to keep an eye on Mordor, and they abandoned these watchtowers, and they pulled back, and and Cirith Ungol was abandoned, and then the Orcs and the Nazgul took it over. And so that's the situation that we have now. So the question is, at which stage in this development might these watchers have been placed there? Are they original? Were they part of the original Gondorian design? Or are they something which was put in later by Sauron or the Witch King or someone like that? I think there's two main clues. The first is the design, which doesn't feel very Gondorian to me. The vultures' faces, that's not a very Gondorian thing. In fact, that kind of reeks of death and things like that. So that doesn't feel like it's an original design. And secondly, part of the magic is this blocking enemies. And who are enemies? Well, orcs are friends. The enemies, the hobbits, yes, but also if you go back to earlier drafts from Tolkien, it's very clear that they think that people who might be trying to get through there, who might trigger this, are elves or Gondorians. So this is, the magic is very much post evil taking over Cirith Ungol once more. So as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't make huge amounts of difference in practical terms whether they were original statues and then someone like the Witch King came in and put the magic spells on there, or the Witch King or Sauron, whoever it is, added these to the original design. If I had to guess, it's probably the latter. Okay, so that's the first question. Roman Lakovets saying, you said in one of your shorts that Tolkien didn't like the titles for the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Could you elaborate on that? Yes, I'm very happy to. I did a long form video about that as well. I think that was one of the ones I took down. I will be putting that one back up again at some point. Basically, Tolkien wrote a story called The Lord of the Rings. Now, he wrote it in 6 parts. But when it came to publishing it, yes, the publisher wanted to do this, but they were facing a problem in post-war England, which was the very high cost of paper. So publishing a big, thick book like The Lord of the Rings would have cost a huge amount. They'd have had to charge a huge amount. People didn't have huge amounts of money at the time. And so the publishers said, we're going to have to break this down into 3. Tolkien wasn't happy, but eventually he's accepted that, that's the reality of the situation. If he wanted to get this published, then it would have to be published in 3 parts. And he said, okay, so it's in 6 parts. We can do like parts 1 and 2 as well. First book, 2, 3, and 4. You get the idea. He accepted that. And then the publisher said, we'll need names for these different books. And he says, well, it's The Lord of the Rings part 1, 2, and 3. And they said, well, no, we'll need cool names for them. And so he you can read this all in his letters. It's fascinating, and it's the correspondence on this goes over several letters where he's sort of umming and ahhing about the possible different names, and he's not happy. The Fellowship of the Ring, he decided quite quickly that, and he was happy with that. He thought, okay, that makes sense. That's understandable. So the Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring. Okay, that's good. The second part, the Two Towers, he was okay with, but he had a whole series of these uncertainties about which two towers are we talking about here. Um, so the way in the films they were very clear that this was the two towers of Orthanc and Baradur. That was the two towers, and that was one of the things that he was thinking about. But then he also thought, well, maybe this should be Minas Tirith and Minas Ithil / Minas Morgul. He went through a number of these different possibilities. Then he came to the conclusion that actually maybe we should just let the reader decide what the two towers in question are. Um, so he was never 100% convinced, but he was okay with the title. It's just he wasn't quite sure on what that should mean. And then the Return of the King. He suggested that originally, but then he didn't like this because he thought it was, and he didn't use this word obviously, but he thought it was a bit spoilery. So he thought maybe I can't remember what other titles he suggested for that last part. I think he might have said the War of the Ring or something like that was what he wanted for the part, the third book to be published, to be called. So yeah, he was not happy, but all of this stems from the fact that he thought it should be published in one, and then suddenly it got sprung on him it would have to be in three. And the other thing as well, actually, just a little digression from this, but when you read those letters, you can actually see, we now go, yeah, of course, it's a masterpiece. Of course, everybody's going to love it and read it. But he and the publisher both thought this was a bit of a gamble. Because when after the Hobbit was a massive success, everybody loved the Hobbit, and so the publishers, Stanley Unwin, came back and said, "Can we have another one? Can we have a sequel, please?" And Tolkien goes and says, "Yes, of course, not a problem." Writes this up, and then as he's going along, you see these letters that go there, that he's sort of saying, "This is a lot longer than I was expecting, and this is now not a children's book. This is now aimed at adults." And I think he thought it was really quite a dark book. It obviously had lots of extra layers of mythology underpinning it, that the Hobbit kind of skates over that quite breezily. But he recognised, and the publishers recognised, that this isn't the obvious successor for a children's book. Suddenly, this was a very different beast entirely. So they thought this was a risk, not only because of the paper shortage and the publishing cost, but also this isn't what they were expecting. This isn't what anyone was thinking that the sequel to The Hobbit was going to be. Midnight Sun, what is the situation with the physical location of Valinor? It has changed through the ages. Is it still a place that's literally possible to get to? Yes. Now, we do have to. I did a video on this called something like "Where is Valinor?" or something along those lines, if you want the long answer to this one. But basically, it was a physical place. It was a continent on Arda, the world, to the west. But then they took themselves out of the physical plane, and you can still get there on the boats that Círdan makes, on what is known as the straight path. So basically, the Earth is curved, but then you sort of like just stay in your straight path. Tolkien was he writes it very well, but he very clearly wants it to exist in this kind of like slightly grey area between a physical place and a spiritual place. In as much as saying this is the straight path is not saying that literally Valinor is somewhere, up in a geostationary orbit above the planet. That's not what he's saying. But at the same time, it's not just a purely spiritual thing. It's sort of halfway between the two. And indeed, he even, if you sort of read around the wider Tolkien literature, he talks of some, I think it's actually this is in Silmarillion actually, he talks about some sailors have stumbled across this straight path by accident. And it's very much a physical place. It is physically there, but you can't easily get to it. Hallie Summers saying, glad you've returned from the unlight. Thank you very much. Could Balrogs return to Valinor? Durin's Bane seems more like Radagast than Saruman, pursuing interests or hobbies in Middle-earth. What about Radagast himself? Well, Radagast, one of the Astari, so he's sent on a specific mission to Middle-earth at the express wish of Yavanna, who's the Valar who cares about nature. And the hint here underlying this is that she has seen who's being sent off for the Astari, sees someone like Saruman, who's very much a disciple of Aula, who's Yavanna's husband, incidentally, but he's the smith, and she's concerned that he might be into like damaging the environment and forests and things like that. She's not wrong. He did obviously end up going down that route. And so she wanted her champion to go along as well, who was Radagast. So Radagast wasn't part of the original idea. He just got tagged on, but still had this commission to be supporting the Free Peoples of Middle-earth against the rise of Sauron whenever he rose again. Now, what happened to Radagast was that he just kind of like pieced out, really. He played his small role at the beginning of the Lord of the Rings, and then they sent out scouts. They, being Elrond, sent out scouts from the Council of Elrond just to see what's going on, and they specifically sent them to Radagast's house to catch up with Radagast, but he wasn't there, and they couldn't track him. They didn't know where he'd gone. And Gandalf says, "Yeah, well, he is a master of hues and colors," or something, I think he said, which basically camouflage. So even elves wouldn't be able to find him. So he chose to stay. Basically, he chose to be a part of the nature of Middle-earth. Could he have gone back? Yeah, I think he had stayed true-ish to his mission, but then eventually decided he wanted to stay. As for Balrogs, could they return to Valinor? Durin's Bane seems more like Radagast than Saruman, pursuing interests or hobbies in Middle-earth. Well, yeah, I mean, he was hiding deep underground, basically, Durin's Bane. But he was, and the way to think of the Balrogs in a kind of a Christian theology sense, because this is where Tolkien was sort of coming from, is Morgoth is the original big baddie. He's like the Satan figure falling and bringing with him a whole load of fallen angels who numbered among them the Balrogs. So could they go back to Valinor? Well, I guess theoretically. Entrance to Valinor was decided by the Valar, so if they repent and sort of see the error of their ways and try to be good little Balrogs, then yeah, there's no reason why they couldn't theoretically. But the clear implication is that although they're Maiar, they get fixed into their form of expressing who they are. This kind of fiery demon kind of character. So they're almost beyond change. So theoretically, yes. Practically, no. Martin S., what is the distance between Minas Morgul, Shelob's Lair, and Cirith Ungol? I get the impression the two latter are very close, likely less than an English mile apart, and is Minas Morgul close to, except the stairs. Well, this is one of those ones where the exact numbers I don't know. And Tolkien didn't specifically tell us, and this was 5 miles from here, and all of that's quite rare. In fact, he found it quite hard when he was another thing from his letters, which comes out. He loved doing the maps and things like that. He often actually suddenly found it quite hard when he was going from what he'd written. And he was trying to do a map. It's like, well, how far away are those places? So even Tolkien found it a little bit hard. But the Shelob's Lair, basically, you get the steps. Cirith Ungol Pass, you get the steps going up, and then when you reach the top, that's where you get Shelob's Lair, and Cirith Ungol is sort of just on the other side, not very far away at all. The orcs had that as part of their sort of patch, that they would be up to the edge of Shelob's Lair. That's where they would be patrolling and the like. So you said likely less than an English mile. Yeah, absolutely. That's very close. I think probably even less than that. A few hundred meters would be my guess. In terms of Minas Morgul, so there's a bit further distance there. They had to actively travel from Minas Morgul was Minas Ithil. That, if you're imagining a map of Mordor in that part of Middle-earth, Minas Ithil, which became Minas Morgul, was the twin city of Minas Tirith. So if you're imagining Minas Tirith, and then you've got in the middle, you've got Osgiliath with the river, Anduin there, and then you got Minas Ithil, which became Minas Morgul. So that's sort of like on a line there with Minas Tirith. Midnight Sun asking where Tolkien's Catholicism is most explicit. I mean, quite a few places. He very much said afterwards, he looks back, he thinks of it as a religious work as a whole. But in terms of where the most obvious things come out, I think the conception of God and Iluvatar as this creator god, and then you get the fallen angels, that kind of whole cosmogony idea, that does come across as very Catholic. The thing that he highlighted in particular was lembas bread, the way bread, the elven way bread, that he thought this was very, because of the way that he describes it, it's not just, oh, here's a magically very filling food. It's spiritually nourishing as well. And he thought that was the equivalent of a communion wafer, and he thought that was, out of everything, that was probably the thing that to him felt closest to that. Martin S., are there any remains of Autumno or Angband deep underground somewhere in northern Middle-earth in the Third Age? Now, Martin, I think actually someone else has asked a very similar question. Not sure if I'll be able to find this now, but I will. Oh yes, Ranabir Mitra said, I wanted to ask about Autumno. We know about the destruction of Angband, but Autumno is not explicitly said to have been destroyed. If you inspect the maps of the First and Second Age, Autumno could be under the ocean near the lands where King Ardavui, met the Lusoth people. Do you believe this fortress still had a role in Middle-earth? My headcanon says that the fortress plays a role in regard to the nameless things in the oceans of Middle-earth. Okay, so one of the things that makes the Silmarillion, in my view, quite a challenging read, particularly first time through, is the fact that the geography changes. So you think you're just getting your head around roughly where things are, and then everything just shifts. Continents disappear, islands appear, then get destroyed, whole swathes of land just aren't there anymore. Lots goes on between the ages. If you look at the map of Middle-earth that we know now, if you imagine to the west of that used to be Beleriand's this extra land where most of the action in the First Age happened. At the northern edge of that was Angband, which was Morgoth's fortress. Now, before Angband, he had a place called Utumno, which Tolkien never explicitly says where it is, but he does say it's under or near the Iron Mountains, which were, again, in the north. They stretched all the way across the north of Middle-earth. So we're specifically told about, yes, Morgoth's second, Angband, his second stronghold, that was destroyed during the War of Wrath at the end of the First Age. We're not specifically told about Utumno, but clearly it seems to have been in the bit of land that was just destroyed. It's just washed under the sea. So what is there? So Martin's saying, are there any remains left deep underground somewhere in northern Middle Earth? Angband, no. I think it's pretty clear that was part of the land which is now drowned. Utumno, it's slightly less clear, but again, the implication is that this is part of the land which is now deep underwater. Might there be something? So Ranabir added a little bit that his headcanon says that the fortress plays a role in regard to nameless things in the oceans of Middle-earth. So Utumno being an evil place, now the nameless things in Middle-earth sort of emanating from there in the oceans. So nameless things, for those who don't know, I think I did a video on this one. But the nameless things are mentioned in passing by Gandalf in after he died and came back as Gandalf the White. He briefly describes what happened to Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, and he says that he fell off the Bridge of Castle Doom, went all the way to the bottom, went through these deep, dark corridors and caverns, and eventually worked his way back up to the top. And as part of that, he says, far, far below the deepest delvings of the dwarves, the world is gnawed by nameless things. Even Sauron knows them not. They are older than he. So this is something that's Gandalf goes on to say, I'm not going to talk about them, because even talking about them brings a little bit of darkness into the world. So we often think one of these is the Watcher in the Water. I think that's a fair guess to say that is the case. As for there being nameless things out to the sea, we're not told that specifically. There are sea monsters. Whether these are the same as the nameless things, it's never made 100% clear. Midnight Sun saying, Crafty Spirit asks, who was King Bladorthin? I was actually reading about this just the other day. But this is one of those ones where, if you often watch these live streams, rather than I don't want to just blag a little bit and pretend to answer something. I'll give you a proper answer on this one. If I'm having a mind blank on somebody or an issue, then I will come back to it next week. In fact, I've got one from, I think it's Charis Ballerina. I don't know if you're in the chat. You did a super chat a couple of weeks ago, and I said I will pick up on this. And next time we do a Tolkien one, I've got that, and I will come to that in a moment. So yeah, I will come back to that question. Oh, Charis Ballerina, you are there. Just got a question from you. Picking up one. Thank you very much for people picking up questions for others in the chat. I hugely appreciate that. It's a lot of things go through. I'm talking all the time here. It's very hard to read stuff at the same time as talk. if the highlighters are super chats, I will spot them. Otherwise, I can't guarantee I'm going to spot them. So when people do super chats on behalf of other people's questions, that's incredibly generous of them. So thank you. But anyway, Carlos Ballerina picking up a question for impending inspiration. What's up with Aula? He has a bad track record with his protégés turning evil. Is he at odds with the other Valar? This is an interesting one. So Aula the Smith, when you're talking about bad track record, what we're talking about here really is Sauron and Saruman. So each of the Valar had certain Maiar who were kind of attached to them. In the Blessed Realm, they would be like their disciples, basically. And those Maiar who were attached to a certain Valar, they would sort of take on some of those interests, characteristics, skills, that kind of thing. So, for example, we've already talked about Radagast and Yavanna. Radagast clearly loves the environment, wildlife, nature, things like that, and that's reflective of Yavanna. Sauron and Aula was the smith, the creator, the maker of things, the crafter of things, and Sauron, who was at the time known as Myron, and Saruman were both Maiar attached to him. So what's going on with him? I don't think this is him being an evil Valar or anything along those lines. This is because the longest interaction we have, focus that we have for him, is with the creation of the dwarves. I think this gives us the insight into what's going on here, actually, because the story there goes is that the Valar are waiting for the children of Iluvatar to turn up, elves and humans. They know they will, but they don't know when. And so Valar are just like kind of kicking their heels, just waiting, hanging around. But Aula is a creator. And almost to kind of like to bide his time, he creates the dwarves. Now, he can't put the divine spark into them. He can't make them come alive, as it were. They're just automatons. But he created them. Then we have this interaction where Iluvatar just like turns up and says, "So what are you doing?" And he's there going, yeah, because I was just kind of like making these things because, that's what I do. I make stuff. And Iluvatar's there saying, but that's not, you're supposed to be here waiting for the children of Iluvatar. That's not your job. You can't create things. Only I can create things kind of ex nihilo. Look, they're not like, they're just automatons. They can't do anything at all anyway. And Aula, to his credit, goes, "Oh wow, I didn't even think about this. That it might look like I'm kind of like trying to take your place. I'm trying to mock you. Anything. Tell you what, I will destroy them." And so he's about to destroy them, and then Iluvatar comes in and says, "No, it's okay. I've now breathed life into them, but they now need to sleep. Elves have to come first. All part of the ineffable plan, etc., etc." So what that showed was that Aula showed a number of things. He has within him this desire to create, to craft, and that could spill over into wanting to take over the role, as it were, of Iluvatar, the creator god. Aula, however, passes the test, and when he kind of like realizes that he's stepping quite close to that mark, he immediately jumps back straight away. The Maiar around him perhaps did not have that wisdom. So Sauron, he crafts things, he makes things. Similarly, Saruman does, but both of them didn't have the wisdom to take the step back that Aula did. So what's with him? I think perhaps I mean, maybe he wasn't good at sort of training the Maiar around him into how to use their powers for good. But him in and of himself, no, he's one of the good guys. Midnight Sun, why is there a timeline for the arrival of races? Because that's all part of Aru's ineffable plan. I'm afraid that's just one of those things. Cranach Woman saying, hello, Robert. I really want to thank you for getting me into the Rings of Power. I wasn't convinced at first, but thanks to your streams, I gave those episodes more attention, and I absolutely love it now. Well, I'm glad you're enjoying it. So they have now confirmed season 3 is happening. Just so you know, it was never really in doubt, but there was a very long gap after the end of season 2 before they formally announced that season 3 was happening. But thank you. I'm glad you're enjoying it. Let's go to Gina Z saying, "Hi Robert, happy Thursday, and to you too. Could you explain how Galadriel, Celeborn, Elrond, and Gandalf were able to communicate telepathically? I'm thinking of the passage towards the end of The Return of the King where this is described. Is this a power that some elves possess intrinsically? And/or would the Rings of Power have amplified or affected this ability for the ring bearers? Thanks very much." Right, so the bit that you're referring to, a lot of people kind of blink and you miss it, but they don't really pick up on this. But after the main story of the Lord of the Rings and everybody's sort of going home, then we get we get this. They're all sort of heading off in a big group before they start splitting off. And we read this. Often, after the hobbits were wrapped in sleep, they, meaning Celeborn, Galadriel, Gandalf, and Elrond, would sit together under the stars, recalling the ages that were gone and all their joys and labours in the world, or holding counsel concerning the days to come. If any wanderer had chanced to pass, little would have been seen or heard, and it would have seemed to him only that he saw grey figures carved in stone, memorials of forgotten things now lost in unpeopled lands. For they did not move or speak with mouth, looking from mind to mind, and only their shining eyes stirred and kindled as their thoughts went to and fro. So, beautiful poetic language, but they're having a telepathic conversation. Now, if you start digging into this, you'll find that you get lots of these kind of instances of bits of telepathy. We know about Galadriel. Obviously, she kind of looks into the minds of the Fellowship when they arrive in Lothlorien. Gandalf seems to have a telepathic link with Shadowfax. So there's lots of these kinds of things dotted about. Which led to some people wondering whether this was the Rings of Power, who they gave them this ability in some way. But the passage that I just read, that's from after the One Ring has been destroyed and the Rings of Power had lost their power. So it's not that. But if you dig even deeper, you find an essay that Tolkien wrote. And he did this quite a few times. He would just for his own amusement, as much as anything else, he would write on some esoteric issue in his legendarium. He would just write an essay on it. And this one that he wrote, 8 pages, on the subject of what the word he used was osanwe, which translates as communication of mind. And what he says in that is that in theory, everyone, men, elves, Maiar, Valar, can communicate with their minds. So humans find it a lot harder, but some, the strongest-minded humans, can. And if you look, you see Denethor does this. He can kind of cast his mind far and communicate and read people's minds. He did the way Tolkien. If you ever go to Lord of the Rings, when you start to get into Denethor, the way he describes him as being, he's kingly, this guy Denethor. Yes, he's gone down a very dark path personally, but he's this almost Numenorian figure in the way that he's incredibly strong mind that wasn't overtaken. He had Sauron. He basically was like looking and having these kind of mind battles with Sauron through the Palantiri. And although Sauron did manage to kind of like make him focus in on all of the terrible things and they'd drive him basically to madness, Sauron didn't overpower him and use his mind because he couldn't, because Denethor's mind was very strong. So you have all that, and one other thing which is quite interesting is that we have, if you have to be able to concentrate hard in order to do this. Some people, some races, obviously like the Valar, can do it because they're much more powerful. Maiar can because they're powerful. The elves, the more powerful the elves are, the more likely they are able to. So, those guys that we were talking about just now, they can do it because they're powerful elves. There are three things, apparently, three factors that can make it easier to do this. And he lists them as affinity, urgency, and authority. So affinity, if you've got a connection to someone, if you know them really well, that just makes it a lot easier to be doing the kind of the telepathic thing. Urgency, if you desperately need to be saying something. So, for example, when Frodo has the ring on, and just this is after Boromir had tried to take it from him, and he sat down in the chair of seeing, and Sauron is looking for him, and then he hears in his head this voice, "Take off the ring, you fool." That's Gandalf, and it's the urgency is there. Gandalf knew that he had to get Frodo to take off the ring right at that moment. And then authority. If you are a king or somebody in a position of authority, that makes it easier for you to be doing this. So the unexpected, certainly was unexpected to me when I first uncovered this essay, but the unexpected answer is that this isn't just like a thing that a small number of people can do because they've learned a particular ability. Theoretically, this is something that everyone in Middle-earth can do. Let's go to Maura Lee. Hi there, Maura, by the way. Great to see you. Saying, in The Return of the King, there is an aftermath of what happens to the major characters after the defeat of Sauron. What do you think? Do you agree with how each of the major characters' story arcs ends, or would you rather have Tolkien had written a different ending? And if so, which character or characters and how would you had rather see their story arcs play out? Well, I'm going to give the boring answer to this one, Frederick. I think it's a masterpiece, and I wouldn't want to change any of it. Yes, there are some people's stories end in bittersweet or sad ways, and yes, I personally, we all do, want to know a bit more about what happened, but I wouldn't change a word. I absolutely wouldn't change a word. There's nothing there that I would go, oh, if only such and such. Even down to Bill the Pony, what happens to Bill the Pony? I just find that Tolkien wrapped up all of these character arcs in a wonderful way that that rewards you having read deeper and understanding deeper, which is astonishing given the fact that at the time when that was published, all of this extra stuff wasn't published at all. But Tolkien knew that when that other stuff comes out, that would help you understand what's going on. So Galadriel's, for example, Galadriel's story arc, with her returning to the Blessed Realm, that hits so much harder when you understand all of her own character arc. And similarly, Elrond returning, or Círdan going back. So all of just those characters heading to the Blessed Realm. That is the right place for their stories to end. But Maura also asked, I'm interested in learning more about the various wizards in Tolkien's Legendarium and their relationships with the other characters of Middle-earth besides Gandalf. Okay, so we have the Order of the Astari. I'm actually writing a video on this at the moment, so it's fresh in my mind. The Order of the Astari. Astari basically just means wise one, which has this kind of wizards sort of feel to it. But there's 5 of them, and they are Maiar. And we've got Gandalf, we've got Saruman, we've got Radagast, and we've got the 2 blue wizards. Now, there is one passing reference to, we do not know the number of them from Tolkien, but almost certainly he did decide, 5 is the number. There was one more Maya who was with them way back when the elves first awoke, who was Melian the Maya. So she was part of them. She was the leader. This has only recently come out, actually, although there were hints about it in what we'd already had. But with The Nature of Middle-earth, a new book which came out, edited by Carl Hostetter, this came out, I'm going to say 3 years ago, maybe. And we learned about this group of Maiar who were sent. They were called the Guardians, who were sent to protect the elves from Morgoth right at the very beginning times. They came robed in power. That was a mistake, because it prompted the elves to go, is this really just like a kind invite for, you can come over to Valinor? If it is, why on earth are these incredibly powerful beings just standing around here looking at us all the time? And then they started getting suspicious and thinking maybe the Valar are just trying to get us out of Middle-earth because they want it. And that's what led to this division of the elves. Some of the elves went off to Valinor. Some stayed where they were. Some started and gave up along the way. So that's how you start to get these divisions in the elves. That, the Valar said, at least partly was because they sent the Maiar, who were there genuinely to help, clothed in all of their power and glory. So the next time when they sent them, in the Third Age, they said, no, this time you're going to look like old men. And so nobody's going to be, when they just look at you, nobody's going to be scared. Nobody's going to be thinking, we have to do what these people say. So that's the setup. We've got the 2 blue wizards. We don't know much about them. Tolkien, in one of his letters, admitted that even he didn't really know much about them. He was writing a story about Northwestern Middle-earth, and they went off to the east. So he doesn't know huge amounts about them. Radagast we've talked about a little bit already, and Saruman started off going to the east, but then when he sensed Sauron starting to rise once more, he came back to sort of northwest Middle-earth. Now, what's their relationship with the wider world? So the blue wizards, they, over time, we're told they probably fell a bit like Saruman, but in their own individual ways, and they founded cults. Probably that's what Tolkien speculates, that in the wake of Sauron's demise, they sort of set themselves up as cult leaders. They didn't have any interactions that we know of more broadly, but they must have done over in the East. Radagast largely kept to himself. He did have some. I mean, the people in the area knew of him, and obviously had some dealings with him. Bjorn, for example, is aware of Radagast and thinks that he's an okay wizard, as these things go. But they're not like firm friends or anything like that. Radagast largely kept to himself, as far as we can tell. Saruman, he played a lot more of a political game, setting himself up in Orthanc, and then was interacting with the Dunlendings, slowly building his army up with them. Gandalf, he didn't have a home, and he was just wandering around all over the place. So he seemed to have had good relations with Radagast. Saruman was a bit jealous of him because he got given the ring of power, and also because Galadriel wanted Gandalf to be heading up the White Council. Okay, we've got. Let's have a quick look in the chat. Conor Murphy saying Tolkien revised the history of the Blue Wizards multiple times. Yeah, he did indeed. There's at some point he says they came in the Second Age as well, but they were never a major thing. It's just like a little sentence here or there. Okay, so Midnight Sun saying Tolkien uses a soft magic system, which you've spoken of favourably. Do you have a favourite hard magic system? Does Harry Potter count as hard magic? Does Harry Potter count as hard magic? I guess Harry Potter probably does count as hard magic in as much as I'm not as much a Harry Potter expert, but it certainly seems to be if you create your potions, you have to have these specific things, and if you're casting a spell, then you need to remember not just the words to say, but the way that you sort of flick your wand around. It's Wingardium Leviosa, not Leviosa, that kind of thing. So it's the inflections on the words are important. So yeah, it's I would say that is at the softer end of hard magic systems, but it is under the technical terms. Yes, that is a hard magic system. Let's go to Catherine Furseth saying, "Hi, Robert. I'm currently rereading The Lord of the Rings, and I was wondering who actually gave Frodo permission to enter the Undying Lands at the end of the story. I always remembered it as either the Valar or the Elves, but then I came to this section after the defeat of Sauron. This is the quote. Then Queen Arwen said, 'A gift I will give you, for I am the daughter of Elrond. I shall not go with him now when he departs to the Havens, for mine is the choice of Luthien. And as she, so have I chosen, both the sweet and the bitter. But in my stead you shall go, ring-bearer, when the time comes, and if you then desire it. If your hurts grieve you still, and the memory of your burden is heavy, then you may pass into the west, until all your wounds and weariness are healed. But wear this now, in memory of Elfstone and Evenstar, with whom your life has been woven.' And she took a white gem like a star that lay upon her breast, hanging upon a silver chain, and she set the chain about Frodo's neck. Where the memory of the fear and darkness troubles you, she said, this will bring you aid." So you then finish off saying, which makes it sound like Arwen was the person who sort of gave the gift to Frodo. Is that right? Well, yeah, it's an interesting one because does Arwen have the authority to do this? She certainly talks as if she's got the authority to do this. But entry to Valinor, the Undying Lands, this is at the prerogative of the Valar. So what's going on? thankfully, again, we can go to the letters. And Tolkien, I mean, it's a longish quote, but I think this answers this specifically. It is not made explicit. This is what Tolkien says. It is not, or in fact, I think this one is Christopher Tolkien's notes on on his father's letters. So I don't think that affects how much weight we place on it. Christopher Tolkien was the greatest authority that we have on his father's work. It is not made explicit how Arwen could arrange this. She could not, of course, just transfer her ticket on the boat like that. For any except those of Elvish race, sailing west was not permitted, and any exception required authority, and she was not in direct communication with the Valar, especially not since her choice to become mortal. What is meant is that it was Arwen who first thought of sending Frodo into the west, and put in a plea for him to Gandalf, direct or through Galadriel, or both. And Pardon me. And she used her own renunciation of the right to go west as an argument. Her renunciation and suffering were related to and enmeshed with Frodo's. Both were parts of a plan for the regeneration of the state of men. Her prayer might therefore be specially effective, and her plan have a certain equity of exchange. No doubt it was Gandalf who was the authority that accepted her plea. The appendices show clearly that he was an emissary of the Valar and virtually their plenipotentiary in accomplishing the plan against Sauron. He was also in special accord with Círdan, the shipmaster, who had surrendered to him his ring and so placed himself under Gandalf's command. Since Gandalf himself went on the ship, there would be, so to speak, no trouble either at embarking or at the landing. Which is, I think, pretty clear. So this was Arwen's first thought. She saw Frodo, she saw the pain and suffering that Frodo had been through, and thought, you know what, he should be let into the Undying Lands. He should be allowed to go to a place of peace and a place of healing. And I've chosen not to go. So it just seems fair that, there's a space there. He should do that. And she didn't have the authority to say, yeah, you can go, Frodo. But she did know more powerful people, particularly, for example, Galadriel, her grandmother, and Gandalf. And Gandalf here, I mean, Tolkien bigs up his role in a way that Christopher Tolkien here bigs up his role in a way that his father doesn't always explicitly do so, but he basically says, yeah, so he's basically the emissary here for the Valar in Middle-earth at this moment in time. He's in contact with them, and so he would be the person who would be able to decide these things. And if there were an issue, he could just smooth it over. So that's where this all fits together. It was Arwen's first thought and idea, but Gandalf was the person who authorized it on behalf of the Valar. Let's go to Relaxed Like a Cat, saying, hi, Robert. This is a somewhat speculative question, but if George R. R. Martin rewrote The Hobbit, what changes might we expect to see? So, I think the first point to say is George R. R. Martin hero worships Tolkien. I mean, we often kind of play up this idea that he critiques him and he's a reaction against Tolkien. He loves Tolkien. I defy you to find any long form interview that he's done with anyone about his writing when he does not name check Tolkien at least once, and usually he does it many, many times just in each interview. He adores Tolkien. So I don't think he would rewrite it. I don't think he would make a change. But it's probably worth here just expanding on the genre that's, I wouldn't say, or subgenre. I wouldn't say that George R. R. Martin was like the creator of it so much as that he's certainly the most well-known early creator within this grimdark subgenre. Grimdark is a type of, if you've not come across this phrase before, it's a type of fantasy that has a lot more violence, often a slightly darker ending, and the characters are a lot more morally grey. Now, Tolkien's characters are often, I mean, I'm always defend Tolkien's characters as being a lot more morally complex than people often think of them as being, but there can be no doubt that we have the good guys, we have the bad guys in Tolkien. We know who the good guys are and what their mission is. We know who the bad guys are, and whereas there are a few sort of more neutral characters in the middle, it is a story ultimately of good versus evil. That is not the case in George R. R. Martin's kind of world, and this subgenre that we got. So, A Song of Ice and Fire is not an easy who's the good guys, who are the bad guys, what's going on here. Even the sides that we would automatically think of as being the bad guys, the others, the White Walkers, I have a feeling that we will discover that there is, unlike on the TV show where they did make them want to go out and kill humans, then I think we will find that there's an extra layer here of what's motivating them, what's going on there. And characters like, for example, Tyrion, who is one of the more sympathetic characters. When you actually kind of dig into him, he does some absolutely abhorrent things. Doesn't make you not want to be sort of like reading from his perspective or even enjoying his take on things, but he does some really dark things as well. So I think the short answer is that if you were to rewrite The Hobbit in a grimdark fashion, then you would get, playing up the more morally ambiguous dwarves roles here. You would perhaps understand a little bit more about where Smaug is coming from. It's not really his fault. He's a dragon. He can't help it. That kind of feel, and the innocence and hope created by a character like Bilbo would probably be, if not lessened, balanced out by other things. Rassler, why did Saruman return from the east? And does he have contact with the Blue Wizards? Also, why did Gandalf never go east when they suspected Sauron was in the east? Okay, so the Blue Wizards. So when the five Istari arrived, they basically spread out. Now, the idea was that they were there to go and help the free peoples of Middle Earth against the rise of Sauron. They didn't know where Sauron was, where he was coming back. You say when they thought he was the east would be the obvious place for him to go. It's not that they specifically thought he's definitely there. The east would be the obvious place for him to go because that's where his supporters were. That's where the peoples that had been under his sway for so long were, and so him sort of coming back in secret, that's the best place for him, really. So it kind of makes sense that the Blue Wizards went out there, as did Saruman. And to start with, and while we're talking about the East, it's probably worth mentioning this isn't just like a country. We talk about the East Run, like the place to the east. This is massive. This is continent spanning. This is huge. There's cultures. There's different type. There's mountainous areas. There's woods. There's massive lakes. There's loads of different stuff going on. So it's not like they're just going to a small bit of Middle Earth. It's just like probably an even bigger bit of Middle Earth than the bit that we have on the map that we know so well. So the Astari split up. 3 went roughly in the direction that they thought it most likely that he would be. Radagast, we're not told all of his history, but clearly he ended up on the fringes of Mirkwood. He wanted to be near nature. Near nature, as we've spoken about a little bit earlier in the stream, he didn't put himself forward for this mission. He was pushed into it. So perhaps even from the beginning, his commitment to that compared to his commitment to nature were a lot more sort of balanced than for others. Gandalf stayed in the northwest and just sort of roved around. He never set up a permanent base anywhere. So why didn't they go? Because they wanted to cover a whole load of different possible places where Sauron could be coming. Why did Saruman come back? Because he could sense that Sauron was starting to recover and make a return. Evil was starting to move, and it seemed the place where it seems to be most concentrated was in southern Mirkwood. So, and then in the Misty Mountains and all of that area up around, heading north from there. So that's why he came back, because it seemed that was now the most likely place where he was going to be. Added to which, Saruman was studying ring law through this time. It was a slow descent for him. He was studying ring law, and he slowly became more and more obsessed by the ring. And everyone knew that the One Ring had been lost in the Gladden Fields. Now, what did that mean? That in terms of where it was now, well, somebody could have picked it up and taken it somewhere else, but then you'd probably expect to hear about that. So the most logical place, if you were fascinated by the One Ring, and even if you weren't admitting it to yourself yet, kind of looking for it yourself, that's why you might return. Charis Ballerina. I've never understood the 2 trees. This is the 2 trees of Valinor. Wouldn't they be blinding? It's the power of the sun. Why 2? Does one shut off to make night, or is it always day? The moon doesn't emit its own light, so why does the tree? How big are they? Well, we're not told exact sizes, but yes, so they've got, so one's golden, one is silver. And they kind of wax and wane. So one of them is bright and the other one is dim, and then they kind of like swap over. And there's this moment in the middle where they sort of cross over, and there's this kind of like magical kind of a blending of the lights. Would they be blinding? Well, yeah, in as much as you could see the light that they emitted out across the ocean. But Tolkien doesn't really kind of address this in a kind of a practicality way. The Valinor, the Undying Lands, all he said is that although they are clearly physical places, there is a spiritual element going on there as well. I think if we, and clearly a magical element, if we try and sort of just interpret this as, well, there's these 2 trees with like kind of battery lights sort of shining out, then yeah, they would be blinding, and the light wouldn't be, it wouldn't get everywhere, because, if you build a wall, then the light can't come through the wall. this is magical light. That this was the light which lit up all of the land. So it's not in the same way that we kind of struggle, but we understand completely what is meant by the idea that Ungoliant emitted unlight. It's not an absence of light. She emitted unlight. The light that came from the two trees of Valinor was not a normal light. This was magical light, holy light is probably the best way of saying it. And Chaos Ballerina picking up a question. Thank you very much for Lafayette Sunset. Was Círdan's foresight a self-fulfilling prophecy? He gave Gandalf Narya because he saw he was better than Saruman, but that partly started Saruman down his dark path in the first place. I mean, it's an interesting point. I think this did contribute to it, but I would definitely not say that the biggest, or even one of the biggest, contributory factors in Saruman's fall was the fact that Gandalf got the ring. Now, Saruman was already quite a haughty spirit, let's put it that way. Even before he set off from Blessed Realm, he didn't like the idea of Radagast coming along. He didn't want to share a boat with Radagast. He didn't like that at all, because he didn't think that they were equals. That tells you that his attitude and approach was already pretty bad, and it just got worse. The more he then started to focus in on ring law, and that turned from an academic interest in it to actually, how do I do this? And then obviously through the Palantiri, there was contact with Sauron. That path was happening anyway. So Círdan's foresight was to give it to Gandalf, give the ring to Gandalf, because Saruman was going to go down a dark path, and Gandalf with it would be able to stay the course. So, yeah, I don't. Although I understand it, and it might be a part of the picture, I don't think that is the self-fulfilling thing going on there. Have a quick flick through the chat. Connor Murphy saying the Silmarils later contained the same pure light. Yes, so the light from the two trees was captured within the Silmarils, which actually, incidentally, also kind of answers the question about the Silmarils as why, if they had this light, was that not blinding? And it clearly was very bright, but we don't hear people being literally blinded by even a remotest glance at them. Yeah, it's the holy light. And Carl Karsnark saying the glowing world tree shows up in the Elden Ring video game that George R. R. Martin helped with a while back. Yeah, absolutely, that's central to it. It's the, I've not played the game. I've seen it played, but I've not played the game myself. But that's a central part of the landscape there. The tree there. That's flicking through the chat. Kelly Summers saying if Saruman had Narya, maybe he would have studied that rather than the One Ring and been able to make his own ring and been satisfied. Well, he did make his own ring. This is like one of those things that Tolkien just kind of drops in there. Is that Gandalf, when he goes to see Saruman, he notices, just in passing, that he's wearing a ring. And then when Saruman rather grandly announces all of his titles, Saruman of many colours, etc., then he says, Saruman Ringmaker. Saruman had been studying ring law, and he had made himself a ring of power. Now, definitely not to the same power that the rings of power we know about are, but this was like his first attempt. So impending inspiration are saying, as per your recent video about Gandalf, would Sauron be similarly aware of the Blue Wizards? How close would that relationship be? Yeah, similarly. So the answer, if you saw the video, did Sauron know about Gandalf, is that he will have been aware of him, and he will know that he's some kind of emissary from the Valar. And he may, I mean, they certainly will have known of each other way back in Blessed Realm, but that was a long time ago, thousands of years ago. So it's possible Sauron will have only got sort of vague, hazy memories from that, because Maiar do forget things. They are fallible. I think we often think, oh, well, they'll remember everything, but they can't remember everything. So, will he have been aware of the Blue Wizards? Almost certainly. And probably he will have played some subtle role in their fall, would be my guess. But we don't know that. It's just he will have been aware. Let's go to Ranabin Mitra. We've done that. That was the question we had earlier about Autumno. Andrew Biederman saying, what powers do the Valar have over events and the children of Iluvatar? The specific mystery I want to know about is the curse of Morgoth on Húrin and his family. Did he really have the power to do this? Events largely seem to have played out according to what Morgoth intended with this curse. But if he could really curse like this, why wouldn't he have done so to every meaningful enemy among Man and Noldor? It's a good question. So for those who don't, this is from the Children of Húrin story, which is way back in the First Age, one of the three great stories of the First Age that Tolkien tells, and also probably the darkest. With Tolkien, there's always hope, but here, the Children of Húrin is relentlessly depressing, in a kind of like a good tragic way, a good storytelling way, but still it's it kind of drags at your soul a little bit. But anyway, one of the early starting points is we get this guy called Húrin, who Morgoth captures, and he's trying to, one of the big things that Morgoth is trying to do at this point is trying to discover the hidden city of Gondolin. He knows that there's lots of elves who are based there. He doesn't know where this is. Húrin refuses to say. And so Morgoth ties him to a chair onto the side of the mountain and makes him magically be able to see out into what's happening out into the wider world. And he curses him. And this is what he says, but upon all whom you love, my thought shall weigh as a cloud of doom, and it shall bring them down into darkness and despair. Wherever they go, evil shall arise. Whenever they speak, their words shall bring ill counsel. Whatsoever they do shall turn against them. They shall die without hope, cursing both life and death. So say, quite dark stuff. And Húrin there, poor guy, does have to see his children go through tragedy after tragedy. And so it appears that Morgoth's curse has an impact. Why doesn't he just use this on others? In Tolkien, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, it is a noticeably soft magic system. So it's not like a spell list of saying, aha, I have now unlocked the spell curse. I'm going to curse you, curse you. That's not how this works in this system. magic and power and words are kind of inextricably bound, and the borders between them get quite blurred. And so it's like curses have power in Tolkien's world. So what Morgoth here was doing was a curse. But it was like in that moment that worked. It's not just like he can now just like zap another person with a curse and another person with a curse. There are moments and times and ways of speaking which imbue them with power. And that was what was going on there. So yeah, he probably could have done that a bit more if he'd sat down and thought about it, but it's not as simple as saying, well, I'll just recreate this and do that kind of thing again. Words have power, and they kind of mingle with magic and fate and other things. Ninja Robbo saying, similar to Andrew's question, I always get the impression that the Valar were meant to have power over the world, both tangible stuff like water and less tangible stuff like grief, but not the children of Iluvatar directly, who are meant to have free will. It's always struck me as weird that Mandos has direct control over the dead, deciding on who gets to return to Valinor and when. Yeah, I mean, I think you're broadly right with this, in as much as the Valar have been given power and authority and understanding in line and insight in line with that part of Iluvatar's mind that they have access to is probably the wrong way of saying it. But when he created them, each of the Valar had that part that had access to that part of Uru's being, in as much as, for example, we get Aula the Smith, that he understands, he gets this creative urge that comes from Uru. Yavanna, the love of nature, that comes from Uru. That's not just her, that comes from Uru, and that's an expression of his love for nature. And then you can go through all of the other Valar. They've got their area, and because this comes from Uru, it's not just them. This means that they have authority over that. So Ormo has authority over the sea, which means that he can be moving and shifting the sea and things like that. And Yavanna can grow stuff, not because of her own natural power, but because this is coming from the sort of the demiurge, the power coming from on high. As I say, this is quite Tolkien gets into what we would probably call as quite high fantasy with this, but also the more you get onto the specifics, the more he uses the poetic language, because you get those first bits of the Silmarillion are written in deliberately old style language and deliberately mythological feel. So we're not being encouraged to sort of like come at this with a scientific mind and saying da 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 da, this person can do A, B, and C. We're supposed to kind of understand it in the way that the Greek gods or the Norse gods have control over the elements or whatever their individual thing is. Let's go to another question from Simran Singh here. Question regarding the Legendarium. What do we know about the Nazgul from the Second Age? What, besides the Witch King of Angmar, were the rest up to in the Third Age before they began searching for the Shire? So, anything you can elaborate on about Minas Morgul? Right. And then you have to say, I love listening to your Lord of the Rings and Song of Ice and Fire streams while painting up my Lord of the Rings miniatures. I'm not finding out what people are doing while they're listening to this. Are those the Warhammer ones? They're quite cool. So, in terms of the Second Age, so they are quite quiet. That this is the headline. So it's not that you've missed a lot here. We get the distribution of the rings to the 9 rings to 9 men, 9 humans, happens in the Second Age, some point after the year 1697, I think it is. So at some point after that, the rings get distributed. And as we know, one of the things that the rings do is extend lives. So the people who had them had very long lives, and also they had much increased power. And so in the Second Age, then the quote is that they were mighty, the 9 were mighty in their day, kings, sorcerers, and warriors of old. So that situation where they're not fully Nazgul yet, they're not Wraith-like yet, but they are being their lives are being stretched. That goes until, I think, the year 2251 of the Second Age, at which point we hear that they make an appearance as the Ringwraiths, as the Nazgul. So by that point, they've all given in and are there. But there's a period of maybe up to 400 or 500 years where they are out as humans doing human things and being very powerful, and people not really knowing necessarily why they're being so incredibly powerful. They stay in Mordor, it would appear, when Sauron gives himself up to the Númenóreans, and they survive over there. Then Sauron gets his body gets killed by the downfall of Númenor, and then he heads back, and they have the last alliance. This is a while later. The last alliance. The implication is that they must have been fighting in the last alliance battle, but we're not specifically told about that. But when Sauron, at the end of the Second Age, just going into the Third Age, when the ring is cut from Sauron's finger, he loses all his power and has to start off from scratch. It's the same for the 9 Ringwraiths, because they're connected to the One Ring. Their power comes from the One Ring, as it were. So when Sauron had to slink off without bodily form for a while, they did the same. When Sauron set himself up somewhere, maybe this is around the year 1000 of the Third Age, sets himself up in Dol Guldur in South Mirkwood as the Necromancer. Then a bit after that, that's when we start getting the Witch King. Similarly, he starts to gain in power as well, and he puts himself up in Angmar. It's the year 1856, as Gondor is slowly losing. I think it's the first question answered today, but Gondor slowly pulls back from its watch over Mordor. About the year 1856, that's when the Nazgul re-enter Mordor and they start taking control. A bit later after that, they capture Minas Ithil, turning it into Minas Morgul. So the Witch King, having done his worst up in the north, then comes down and joins them and establishes Minas Morgul as basically their their home base there. What they do then for the next few hundred years is prepare the way for Sauron, because once Sauron gets kicked out during The Hobbit, when the White Council go in and take on Sauron the Necromancer in southern Mirkwood, from there he heads down to Mordor, re-establishes himself, declares himself as being there, and he can do that because the groundwork has been done by the Nazgul. However, he then sends back 3 of the Nazgul up to Dol Guldur, because that is going to be an important base for him in the war to come. So they head up there. They stay there for a bit before he calls them all back at the beginning of the main story that we know, so that they all appear very obviously in that attack on Osgiliath. So everybody thinks they know exactly where the Ringwraiths are. So that, as a sort of a very high level, that's what they were doing. Tolkien doesn't give us much information there. The implication is that they're there leading the forces and preparing the ground for Sauron's return. Martin S. This is your question from last week, I think it is. It was saying, hello, Robert, a continuation of my question about Gil-galad from last week. Exactly how capable in combat do you think Gil-galad was? How would he compare to Glorfindel, in your opinion? On the one hand, Sauron with the One Ring was probably a more dangerous foe than the Balrog, which Glorfindel faced. I would agree. On the other hand, Gil-galad had Elendil with him, and both carried legendary weapons, Aeglos and Narsil. Both Gil-galad and Glorfindel died in their fights with Sauron and the Balrog. My initial take, this is Martin's initial take, is that due to having many more centuries to train as a Noldo elf, Gil-galad was probably a greater warrior than Elendil overall, despite Elendil's size and presumable strength. But when we have Gil-galad versus Glorfindel, I think it is a greater feat shared between 2 people, with probably a greater weapon versus a relatively speaking lesser but still great feat by 1 person. I think they're roughly comparable, maybe with a slight edge to Gil-galad. What do you think? They're both very impressive and powerful fighters. I tend to shy away from this kind of like trying to compare 2 characters who wouldn't fight each other and say, well, who would win in a fight between them? Because there's lots of different variables that are going on there. My general feeling, though, is that whenever you hear Glorfindel described, he is, because he's been back to the Undying Lands and because that's such a holy, nourishing place, it kind of like gives you a power up. And so when he came back to Middle-earth, he was very powerful, and so powerful, in fact, I mean, Frodo asks Gandalf, who is this guy? What's going on here? And we read that when he went out from, relatively early in the story, went out from Rivendell to try and find Frodo and the ring, then there came a point when he was like over a bridge, and there were 5 ringwraiths who took one look and thought, it's Glorfindel, and they just did not go anywhere near him. In fact, they went a day south, crossed another bridge, and then a day north. They went completely out of their way just to avoid Glorfindel, because that's how impressive he is. How does this compare to Gil-galad? I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, as you say, Gil-galad had a legendary weapon, Aeglos the Spear. The Glorfindel didn't, but he quite clearly, I think, in natural power, is more powerful. That's my take, at least. Pardon me. Right, and we've got last question actually here in from my patrons, but I will pick up a few more from the chat as we are going through. And let's go to Chaos Ballerina. This is a question actually from a couple of weeks ago that I said I would come back to you on because I was having a mind blank. There always is a mind blank. I had one earlier on this live stream as well. But you asked then, and I said I would come back to it. What happens to the elven lords of Middle-earth after they go to Aman? Do they assimilate into other kingdoms, or are they given land in Aman to rule? Which is a really interesting question. Because it's basically saying, okay, the ruling elves, the Celeborns, the Galadriels, the Kirdans, the Elrons, the ruling elves here in Middle-earth, when they go over to the Undying Lands, when they go to Aman, do they get to rule lands there? Tolkien did write a bit about this. I've got a few extra little caveats to add to this in a moment, but he did sort of pick up on this in one of his letters when he's talking about the elves staying in Middle-earth and why they might have stayed in Middle-earth. He says there was nothing wrong, essentially, in their lingering against council, still sadly with the mortal lands of their old heroic deeds, but they wanted to have their cake without eating it. They wanted the peace and bliss and perfect memory of the West, and yet to remain on the ordinary earth where their prestige as the highest people above wild elves, dwarves, and men was greater than at the bottom of the hierarchy of Valinor. So that's the first thing, that the clear implication was they liked being top of the tree in Middle-earth. They're big and powerful. Galadriel is one of the most powerful beings in all of Middle-earth. Elrond, similarly. The top elves, the ruling elves, were incredibly powerful. And the clear implication is that they wouldn't have the equivalent level of power back in Aman. Now, in terms of who we've got, though, I think that some who have already been to Aman, they probably, when they go back, would just sort of slot back in where they were. The example here, I think, that we have the biggest example is Galadriel. Now, Galadriel is a member of the ruling family of the Noldor. And I think the implication is that although she'd been ruling lands in Middle-earth, when she went back, she would just slot back into where she was because her family, they'd not died. She would just go back to where she was beforehand, which is a powerful noble, but not herself ruling lands. The interesting question is what happens to those who hadn't got any particular role or place already in Aman. They were just going over there, like Círdan, for example. I don't know because Tolkien doesn't give us the answer, but the clear implication is that someone like Círdan or another lord who's done good in Middle-earth, they would be rewarded in Aman. And what does that reward mean? Well, yes, maybe they would, if their people come with them, maybe they would be able to set up an equivalent of that structure where they were in charge over in Aman. That's the kind of implication we've got. It's just that they wouldn't be top of the tree anymore. They wouldn't be one of the 3 or 4 most powerful elves around. There will be hundreds who are more powerful than them. So I hope that one answers that question. Reflective Rambling, picking up a question for V, thank you very much, saying, I've always wondered about the Feanorian oaths' effect on the sons. Could they have chosen to act differently? What did compelled mean? So this takes us back to the discussion we were having a little bit ago about Morgoth's curse. Um, the words have power in Tolkien's world, and so if Feanor, as he did, he made his sons swear an oath that basically said they have to go and get the Silmarils and not allow anyone else to have them. That had power over them. It was like a promise, but it was a magical promise that meant that they couldn't break that. They had to keep acting in that way. You asked if they could have chosen to act differently. Within reason, I think, as long as it didn't contravene what they swore. So they didn't have to just charge mindlessly at Angband because they knew that inside Angband were the Silmarils. They were keeping within their vow to, as they did. They set up this sort of very long 400-year-old siege of Angband. That was fine as long as their intention was, pardon me, was to at the earliest opportunity get the Silmarils back. Also, when you get to the very end of the First Age, you get the last two of Feanor's sons who get one of the Silmarils each. Both of them basically chose to get rid of the Silmaril and themselves at the same time, which was one way of dealing with this. How do you, technically they're making sure that nobody else ever gets hold of them. You throw into the sea, you jump into a fiery chasm in the earth. That does prevent other people from getting hold of them. It's true, but there are other ways that you could do it. So they still had free will about how they went about this and what they did, but the oath had power that compelled them to keep at their commitment. Martin S. Saying, if you think about it, it's not just Tolkien's magic system that is soft. It's not just Tolkien's magic system that is soft. His treatment of anything unquantifiable in his work, such as population sizes, that is soft and vague. More mystery for it. Yes and no on this. If you start digging into this, you'll find he actually gets incredibly nerdy about some specific details. Now, you can go in the Nature of Middle-earth, which I name-checked earlier in the stream. If you go through that, you'll find that he did whole pages and pages of calculations of elf populations and things like that. That's there, working out intricately which year different things happened. He wrote so many of these different timelines. He was very focused in on that level of detail. It's just that there are some bits that weren't as interesting to him. He wasn't as interested, and this George R. R. Martin is right. He wasn't as interested in the details of good governance as someone like George R. R. Martin is. So it was enough for Tolkien to say, and Aragorn was a good and wise ruler, and the land prospered. That was fine. He didn't need to go in and say exactly all the details of what he did and why and how that impacted on the GDP of Gondor. You know, that's not the kind of level of detail that he cared about. But there were some things that he went into nerdy detail about. Magic, though, right from the start, it was very soft as a description. Martin S. Saying, my impression is that Galadriel's father, Finarfin, is the ruler of the Noldor remaining a man, but it is not entirely clear. Yeah, I think you're probably right there. So I've finished my questions from the my patrons. I will now have a look at some questions in the chat. Carl Karsnark saying Tolkien struggled with this question when it came to orcs. If they have free will, then they choose to be evil. But if a Iluvatar is all powerful, then all beings are simply following his will. Yeah, he went through other things that he answered over. So the theology of stuff, he really he got into at a very deep level that you can see in his letters. So there's a few letters that he writes off to fellow Catholics who are picking up on various things, and he gets into this in really quite deep theological levels. Impending inspiration saying, as per Leibniz, there is a greater capacity for good in a world in which evil exists. So evil orcs are good for the greater good. Wow, blowing my mind. People seem to be getting into the problem of evil and other issues here in the chat, which is fantastic. But I think what I will do is I will say next week I haven't. I'm not around next week. I'm trying to pre-record a thing. I may or may not be able to do that. So fingers crossed I will. But in 2 weeks' time, I will be back with another live stream, definitely. So coming up on the main channel, though, I've got a couple of videos. A Song of Ice and Fire videos coming up. I thought I'd try doing a double header. The Valonqar. Who is the Valonqar? I never actually wrote a video asking who is the Valonqar, and a question which comes up a lot: who is the Hooded Man of Winterfell? It's one of those things that it's literally only 2 paragraphs in Dance with Dragons, but it's a question that, because George R. Martin clearly left it as a mystery, and it's quite near the end of the book, we haven't had a chance to uncover it at all. I've had a go at trying to say who I think the Hooded Man of Winterfell is, but that's all to come. In a couple of weeks we'll get more shorts. I hope you enjoyed the short form videos on this channel that I did recently, a couple of weeks ago or so. I'll be producing another load of them coming up soon, but that is it for this time. If you're watching this back a little bit later, appearing somewhere around here on YouTube, somewhere around here will be a link to my playlist of other live streams. If you want to watch more live streams, appearing somewhere around here is a link to my Patreon page. Martin S. just saying, I didn't know Tolkien had gone into details with numbers in populations. Not numbers in terms of like how many people there are living in Gondor kind of thing, but he's trying to work out the growth of different populations earlier on in his Legendarium. Do check out the Nature of Middle-earth. And that's about it, I think. I will see you again, possibly next week, possibly in 2 weeks' time. But till then, take care, everyone, and I will see you soon.